A young farm girl agrees to marry the son of a wealthy landowner to save her family from poverty. Everyone judged her, but time put each clown in their circus and changed everything. In a small town at the foot of the mountains, where the scent of damp earth mingled with the sweat of hard work, lived Sarah, a young woman of just 18. Her chestnut hair, always tied back in a messy braid, framed a face with delicate features and honey-colored eyes that shone with a mixture of determination and fear at the uncertain future that loomed before her. Sarah's family, the Millers, had been working the land for generations. However, the last few years had been especially hard. Droughts had ruined the crops, and debts piled up like dark clouds over their heads. Sarah's father, John, a man with calloused hands and a back bent from years of working in the fields, faced the possibility of losing the small plot of land that was the family's livelihood. One summer afternoon, as Sarah was helping her mother Mary prepare dinner, a luxurious carriage stopped in front of their humble house. From it descended Mr. Richard Thompson, the most powerful landowner in the region. His imposing presence filled the Millers' small living room, making the space seem even smaller. "Mr. Miller," Mr. Thompson began in a deep voice, "I've come to make you a proposal that could solve all your financial problems." Sarah, hidden behind the kitchen door, listened with her heart racing. The words that followed changed the course of her life forever. "My son William needs a wife in exchange for your daughter Sarah's hand in marriage. I'm willing to cancel all your debts and guarantee your family's well-being for the next 10 years. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah felt the world stop around her. She knew of William Thompson, the landowner's deformed son, the object of whispers and pitying glances in town. She had never seen him in person, but the stories about his appearance and his seclusion in the Thompson mansion were legendary. "But sir," John's trembling voice broke the silence, "Sarah is just a child. She barely knows life." "A child who could save her family from ruin," Mr. Thompson replied coldly. "Think about it, Miller. It's a generous offer." That night, dinner at the Miller's house was a somber affair. Sarah, sitting between her parents, felt the weight of their guilt-laden and desperate gazes. "I can't ask you to do this, daughter," John finally said. His voice breaking with emotion. Sarah looked around. She saw the cracks in the walls, the worn furniture, the weariness in her mother's eyes. She thought of her younger siblings, of their dreams of a better life, and then, with a maturity that surprised even herself, she made a decision. "I'll do it," she said firmly. "I'll marry William Thompson." The following days passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Sarah moved as if in a dream, letting her mother and the women of the town dress her and prepare her for her wedding. She looked in the mirror and barely recognized the pale, serious young woman who stared back at her. The night before the wedding, as she packed the few belongings she would take to her new life, Sarah found a small hand mirror, a gift from her grandmother. She held it up to her face and promised herself that no matter what the future held, she would never forget who she truly was. The morning of the wedding dawned grey and cold, as if the sky shared Sarah's mood. The young woman allowed herself to be dressed in a simple, white dress, a gift from the Thompson family, which cruelly contrasted with the sadness in her eyes. The carriage that would take her to the Thompson mansion waited in front of her house. Sarah hugged her parents and siblings, trying to memorize every detail of their faces, the smell of her home, the sound of the wind through the trees she had known all her life. "Be strong, my child," her mother whispered, holding her tightly. "Always remember that true courage lies in your heart." The journey to the Thompson mansion was short, but to Sarah it felt like an eternity. Each turn of the road took her further away from everything she had known and loved. When the carriage finally stopped in front of the imposing stone structure, Sarah had to summon all her courage. Not to burst into tears, Mr. Thompson was waiting for her at the entrance, his tall, elegant figure contrasting with the austere facade of the mansion. "Welcome, Sarah," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I hope you find your new home satisfactory." Sarah nodded silently, unable to form words. She was led through dark hallways and luxurious but cold rooms, until they reached a small chapel within, the mansion itself. There, in front of an altar adorned with white flowers, she saw William Thompson for the first time. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. William had his back turned, but even so, she could see that his body was unnaturally twisted. His right shoulder rose higher than his left, and his head seemed to sink between them. When he turned to look at her, Sarah had to make a conscious effort not to step back. William's face was a mosaic of disproportionate features. His left eye was smaller than his right, and his nose curved pronouncedly to one side. His lips, thick and twisted, trembled slightly as he looked at her. But it was his eyes that captured Sarah's attention. They were a deep blue, like the sky on a clear night, and they shone with an intensity that left her breathless. In them, Sarah saw fear, hope, and a loneliness so profound that it echoed in her own heart. The ceremony was brief and somber. Sarah heard her own voice, distant and muted, pronouncing the vows that would bind her forever to this man she barely knew. When the priest declared them husband and wife, she felt as if she had signed her own sentence. The dinner that followed was a tense and silent affair. Sarah sat next to William, aware of every movement, of every furtive glance thrown at them by the few guests Mr. Thompson dominated, the conversation talking about business and politics, as if his son's wedding were a mere formality in his daily agenda. Finally, the moment Sarah had been dreading arrived. Mr. Thompson stood up, his voice resonating in the dining room. "It's time for the newlyweds to retire," he announced with a smile that didn't hide his satisfaction. "William, show your wife to her new quarters." Sarah felt her legs trembling as she followed William through the halls of the mansion. The silence between them was heavy, laden with unspoken expectations and fears. When they reached a large carved wooden door, William stopped, his trembling hand on the doorknob. He began, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I understand if you prefer to sleep in separate rooms." Sarah looked at him, surprised by the gentleness in his voice. For a moment she saw beyond his appearance and recognized in him the same vulnerability she felt. "It's our wedding night," she responded softly. "We'll share the room, as is expected of us." William nodded, a mixture of relief and anxiety crossing his deformed face. He opened the door and let Sarah enter first. The room was large and luxurious, dominated by a huge canopy bed. Sarah stood in the center, suddenly aware of the reality of her situation. She was married, and she was expected to fulfill her conjugal duties. "Don't be afraid," William said, closing the door behind him. "I won't do anything you don't want." Sarah turned to look at him once, again surprised by the gentleness in his voice. "Thank you," she whispered, feeling the tears she had been holding back all day finally overflow. William approached her, his movements slow and careful, as if afraid of frightening her. With a tenderness that contradicted his rough appearance, he raised a hand and gently wiped Sarah's tears. "I know I'm not the husband you would have chosen," he said, his voice laden with an ancient sadness. "But I promise to treat you with respect and affection. Perhaps in time we can find some happiness together." Sarah looked into his eyes, those blue eyes that seemed to contain a world of emotions, and for the first time since she had accepted this marriage, she felt a glimmer of hope. The days following the wedding were a period of adjustment for Sarah. The Thompson mansion, with its endless hallways and sumptuous rooms, felt like a labyrinth in which she feared getting lost. Every morning upon waking, she needed a few seconds to remember where she was, and why William, for his part, seemed equally uncomfortable with the new situation. During the day, they barely saw each other. He spent most of his time in his study, taking care of family business, while Sarah wandered around the house trying to find her place in this new world. The nights were a tense affair. They shared the bed, as was expected of a married couple, but an invisible abyss seemed to separate them. William always went to bed after her and got up before dawn, as if he feared Sarah having to face his deformity in the light of day. One morning, almost 2 weeks after the wedding, Sarah decided it was time to break this pattern. She got up early and headed to the kitchen, surprising the servants who weren't used to seeing the new lady of the house in their domain. "Good morning," Sarah greeted with a shy smile. "I'd like to prepare breakfast for my husband. Could you show me where things are?" The cook, a robust woman named Martha, looked at her with a mixture of surprise and approval. "Of course, ma'am. It would be my pleasure to help you." With Martha's guidance, Sarah prepared a simple but hearty breakfast: scrambled eggs, freshly baked bread, and a pot of hot coffee. She placed it all on a tray, and taking a deep breath to gather her courage, headed to William's study. She knocked softly on the door and waited. A few seconds that felt eternal passed before she heard William's hoarse voice. "Come in." Sarah entered. Carefully balancing the tray, William was sitting behind a large wooden desk, surrounded by books and papers. He looked at her in surprise, his blue eyes opening wide. "Good morning," said Sarah, trying to make her voice sound firm. "I thought we could have breakfast together today." William stared at her for a moment as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Then slowly, a small smile formed on his twisted lips. That would be nice," he replied, his voice soft and laden with an emotion. Sarah couldn't identify. Sarah placed the tray on the desk and sat across from William. For a few minutes they ate in silence, but it was a different silence from that of previous days. There was a new comfort in it, a sense that something had changed. "It's delicious," William finally said, looking at Sarah with genuine admiration. "I didn't know you could cook." Sarah felt herself blushing under his gaze. "My mother taught me," she explained. "At home we all helped with the chores." "It must be difficult for you," William said after a moment, "leaving everything behind and coming here." Sarah looked at him, surprised by the understanding in his voice. "It is," she admitted, "but I also know it was necessary. My family—" "I know," William gently interrupted her, "and I want you to know that I appreciate your sacrifice. I know I'm not what a young woman like you would have chosen." Sarah felt something stir inside her at the sadness in William's voice. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand on his. "Perhaps we didn't choose this," she said softly, "but we're here now. I think we could try to get to know each other, don't you think?" William looked at their joined hands, then raised his eyes to Sarah. In his eyes, she saw a glimmer of hope that echoed in her own heart. "I'd like that," he replied with a shy smile. From that day on, something changed between Sarah and William. They began to share more moments together. Sarah started to accompany William in his study, reading while he worked and occasionally helping him with correspondence in the afternoons. They would have tea in the garden, talking about their lives, their dreams, and their fears. Sarah discovered that beneath his rough appearance, William was an intelligent and sensitive man. He had a passion for literature that rivaled her own, and soon they found themselves animatedly discussing their favorite books. One afternoon, as they were walking through the mansion's gardens, Sarah noticed a neglected area in a far corner. "What's over there?" she asked. Pointing to the weed-filled space, William followed her gaze, and his face darkened slightly. "It used to be my mother's garden," he explained. "After her death, no one took care of it." Sarah felt a pang of sadness at the evident pain in William's voice. Without thinking, she said, "We could restore it, if you'd like. I used to help in the vegetable garden at home. It wouldn't be difficult to clean up the area and plant some flowers." William looked at her in surprise, but a small smile formed on his lips. "You'd do that?" he asked, his voice full of an emotion that Sarah couldn't fully identify. "Of course," Sarah replied with a smile. "We could do it together." The following days found them working side by side in the abandoned garden. Sarah taught William how to pull weeds and prepare the soil for new plants. William, despite his deformed body, proved to be an enthusiastic and dedicated student. One afternoon, as they were planting roses, their hands accidentally brushed against each other. Sarah felt an electric current run through her body and looked up to meet William's eyes. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as they stared at each other. It was William who broke the spell, looking away with a slight blush on his deformed cheeks. "I'm sorry," he murmured, returning to his task. Sarah kept looking at him, confused by the intensity of the emotions that simple touch had awakened in her. Was it possible that she was starting to feel something for William? That night, as they prepared for bed, Sarah noticed that William seemed more nervous than usual. Finally, when they were both in bed, he turned to her. "Sarah," he began, his voice barely a whisper. I want to thank you." "For what?" she asked, surprised. "For everything," he replied. "For being kind to me, for not running away from me, for making me feel like I'm more than my appearance." Sarah felt her heart tighten at the vulnerability in William's voice. Without thinking, she reached out and gently caressed his deformed cheek. "You are more than your appearance, William," she said softly. "You're a wonderful man, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to know you." William closed his eyes, leaning into her. Touch. When he opened them again, Sarah saw a glimmer of determination in them. Slowly, as if giving her time to pull away, William leaned towards her. The kiss was soft, barely a brush of lips, but it sent a wave of warmth through Sarah's body. When they parted, they were both breathless. I'm sorry," William began. But Sarah silenced him by placing a finger on his lips. "Don't be sorry," she whispered. "I wanted it too." That night marked a turning point in their relationship. From that moment on, their interactions were charged with a new intimacy. Casual touches became more frequent, glances more prolonged. Sarah discovered that she longed for William's touch, that her heart raced every time he entered the room. However, as their relationship blossomed, a shadow loomed over them. Mr. Thompson began to ask questions, to hint at his desire for an heir. Sarah could see the tension in William's shoulders every time his father mentioned the subject. One night, after a particularly tense dinner with Mr. Thompson, William locked himself in his study. Sarah followed him, worried. "William," she called softly, entering the room. She found him standing by the window, his silhouette outlined against the moonlight. "I can't give you what my father wants," William said without turning around. I can't risk bringing a child into the world who might be like me." Sarah felt her heart breaking at the pain in William's voice. She approached him and hugged him from behind, resting her cheek against his deformed back. "I don't care," she whispered. "I want you, William, with or without children." William turned in her arms, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "You want me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Sarah realized at that moment that it was true. At some point, without her noticing, her feelings for William had blossomed into something deeper, more powerful. "I love you," she said, the words coming out of her mouth with a certainty that surprised her. William stared at her for a moment, as if he couldn't believe what he was. Hearing then, with a choked groan, he pulled her close and kissed her with a passion that took both their breaths away. That night, for the first time since their wedding, they gave themselves to each other completely. Sarah discovered that William's body, despite its deformities, was capable of awakening sensations in her that she had never imagined. William, for his part, touched her with a reverence that spoke of years of longing and loneliness. When they finally fell asleep, tangled in each other, both felt that something fundamental had changed. They were no longer two strangers, united by an arranged marriage, but two souls who had found their home in each other. The following weeks were like a dream for Sarah and William. Their love, now confessed and reciprocated, blossomed like the roses in their restored garden. Each day brought new discoveries, new ways to show their mutual affection. Sarah found in William not just a loving husband, but also an intellectual companion. They spent hours discussing books, sharing ideas and dreams. William encouraged her to explore her own interests, and soon Sarah found herself studying the estate management with as much enthusiasm as dedication. However, like storm clouds on a sunny day, the pressure from Mr. Thompson for an heir began to intensify. His comments, at first subtle, became increasingly direct and biting. One afternoon, as Sarah and William were enjoying a walk in the gardens, Mr. Thompson intercepted them. "I see you're enjoying your time together," he commented, his voice laden with barely veiled sarcasm. "But perhaps you should devote more energy to more productive matters." Sarah felt William tense beside her. Before he could respond, Mr. Thompson continued, "Months have passed. Since the wedding, people are starting to talk. We need an heir, William." a son to secure the future of the Thompson family. "Father, please." William's voice was tense but controlled. "Sarah and I are doing our best. These things take time." "Time is what we don't have," Mr. Thompson roared. "People talk, William. They wonder if you're really capable of fathering a child. Some even suggest I should annul this marriage and find a more fertile wife for you." With those words, Mr. Thompson walked away, leaving Sarah and William in stunned silence. "He can't do that," Sarah whispered, fear tightening her throat. "My family." William pulled her close, holding her tight. "I won't allow it," he promised. "We'll find a solution." That night, as they lay in bed, the weight of Mr. Thompson's words seemed to hover between them. Sarah could feel the tension in William's body, the way his hands trembled slightly as he caressed her. "William," she said softly, turning to look into his eyes. "What are we going to do?" William sighed deeply. "I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me wants to give you a child, Sarah. To see you carry our baby, it would be a dream come true, but—" "You're afraid," Sarah finished for him. William nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "What if our child is born like me? I couldn't bear to see him suffer, be rejected as I was." Sarah took William's face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "Listen to me," she said firmly. "If we have a child, we will love him unconditionally, no matter how he's born. And if he looks like you, I'll love him even more, because he'll be part of the man I love." William looked at her in amazement, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Do you mean that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "With all my heart," Sarah replied. That night they made love with a new intensity, as if they wanted to engrave in their bodies the promise they had just made. And perhaps it was that night, or perhaps it was another in the weeks that followed. But soon Sarah began to notice changes in her body. At first they were subtle, a slight dizziness in the mornings, an unusual tenderness in her breasts. But as the days passed, suspicion turned into certainty. One morning, while William was in his study, Sarah went to town to visit the doctor. When she returned, her face was glowing with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She found William in the garden, pruning the roses they had planted together. When he saw her, he smiled, but his smile faded when he noticed her expression. "Sarah," he said, approaching her with concern, "what's wrong? Are you all right?" Sarah took his hands in hers, her heart beating fast. "William," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I'm pregnant." The world seemed to stop for a moment. William stared at her, his eyes widening. "Pregnant," he repeated, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Sarah nodded, tears beginning to fall down her cheeks. "We're going to be parents," she whispered. For a moment, William didn't move. Then, with a cry of joy, he lifted her in his arms and spun her around. When he put her down, his face was radiant with happiness. "I love you," he said, kissing her fervently. "I love you so much, Sarah. And I'll love our child, no matter what." As they embraced in the garden, surrounded by the roses they had cultivated together, Sarah felt her heart overflow with love and hope. No matter what the future held for them, they would face every challenge together. However, even in that moment of joy, a small shadow of worry slipped into her mind. How would Mr. Thompson react to the news? And how would this baby affect their already complicated family dynamics? The news of Sarah's pregnancy brought with it a mix of emotions for the young couple. On one hand, there was William's overflowing joy, who spent hours talking to Sarah's barely swollen belly, making plans for the future. On the other hand, there was the constant fear of Mr. Thompson's reaction and the possible complications of the pregnancy. They decided to keep the news secret for a while, at least until Sarah passed the first trimester. However, hiding her condition became increasingly difficult each day, especially with the morning sickness and sudden cravings that assailed Sarah at all hours one morning. As Sarah recovered from a particularly strong bout of nausea, she heard heated voices coming from William's study. With her heart in her throat, she quietly approached the half-open door. "It's unacceptable, William." Mr. Thompson's voice resonated with fury. "Months have passed and there's still no sign of an heir. Are you incapable of fulfilling your duty as a man? Father, please. William's voice sounded tense but controlled. Sarah and I are doing everything possible. These things take time. Time is what we don't have, Mr. Thompson roared. People talk, William. They wonder if you're really capable of fathering a child. Some even suggest I should annul this marriage and find a more fertile wife for you. Sarah felt her blood run cold. Annul the marriage? Separate her from William? No, she couldn't allow it. Without thinking twice, she burst into the study. You can't do that, she exclaimed, tears in her eyes. Both men turned to her, surprised by her sudden appearance. Sarah, William began, moving to stand by her side. You shouldn't be here. No, William, said Sarah, taking his hand and facing Mr. Thompson. I have every right to be. Here, this is about our marriage, our life. Mr. Thompson looked at her with a mixture of surprise and disdain. I understand your concern, young lady, he said coldly, but this is a family matter that doesn't concern you. It concerns me more than you think, Sarah replied, standing as tall as she could, because I'm pregnant. The silence that followed her declaration was deafening. Mr. Thompson stared at her, as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. Pregnant? He finally repeated. Is this true, William? William nodded, squeezing Sarah's hand. Yes, Father, Sarah is pregnant. We were going to wait a little longer to announce it, but this is wonderful, Mr. Thompson exclaimed, his face transforming with a smile. An heir for the Thompson family. We must make a formal announcement, organize a celebration. As Mr. Thompson continued talking, making grand plans, Sarah and William exchanged a look. Mr. Thompson's joy was evident, but they both knew that this news would bring new challenges with it. In the days that followed, the Thompson mansion was engulfed in a whirlwind of activity. Mr. Thompson, eager to announce the arrival of the heir, organized a grand party to which he invited all the high society of the region. Sarah suddenly found herself the center of attention, surrounded by women who gave her unsolicited advice about pregnancy and childbirth, and men who congratulated William on his virility. The young woman felt overwhelmed and often sought refuge in the garden she had cultivated with William. It was during one of these escapes that Sarah encountered Martha, the cook, who was looking at her with a strange expression. Is something wrong, Martha? Sarah asked, intrigued by the woman's attitude. Martha seemed to hesitate for a moment before speaking. Ma'am, she began, her voice barely a whisper. There's something you should know something about Mr. William's mother. Sarah felt her heart speed up. What is it, Martha? You can tell me. The cook looked around, as if making sure no one could hear them. Mr. William's mother, she also had difficulties during her pregnancy. Mr. Thompson was obsessed with having a perfect heir. He pressured her a lot, made her undergo all kinds of treatments. Sarah listened, horrified, as Martha continued her story. Apparently, the pressure and treatments had been too much for William's mother's fragile health. She had died shortly after childbirth, leaving behind a deformed baby and a husband consumed by guilt and disappointment. Mr. Thompson never forgave himself, Martha concluded. That's why he's so intense about the heir. He wants to redeem himself, have a second chance. Sarah remained silent, processing all this new information. Suddenly, many things made sense. Mr. Thompson's obsession, William's fear of having children, the abandoned garden. Thank you for telling me this, Martha, Sarah finally said. But why are you telling me now? The cook looked at her with concern. Because I fear history might repeat itself, ma'am. Mr. Thompson seems to be falling into the same patterns. Take care of yourself and take care of your baby. With these words, Martha walked away, leaving Sarah immersed in her thoughts. The young woman caressed her belly, a fierce determination growing inside her. She would not allow history to repeat itself. She would protect her baby and William no matter the cost. That night, as she lay in bed next to William, Sarah made a decision. She had to tell him what she had discovered. They had to face this together. William, she began softly, turning to look at him. There's something I need to tell you about your mother. Sarah's revelation about the Thompson family's past fell like a bombshell in William's life. At first, he refused to believe it, accusing Sarah of making up stories. But as the pieces fell into place, Pain and anger took over him. How could he do that to my mother? William shouted, pacing furiously around the room. How could he risk her life like that? Sarah watched him with a heavy heart, wishing she could alleviate his pain. William, your father was blinded by his desire to have an heir. It doesn't justify his actions, but don't defend him, William roared, turning to her with eyes full of tears. All my life I've carried this deformity, believing it was some kind of divine punishment, and now I find out it was, because of my father's obsession? Sarah approached him, wrapping him in her arms. William resisted for a moment before collapsing against her, his sobs shaking his deformed body. I'm so sorry, my love, Sarah whispered, rubbing his back. But now we know. We can make sure history doesn't repeat itself. William pulled away slightly, looking at her with a mixture of love and fear. Sarah, if anything happened to you because of me, because of this pregnancy, nothing will happen to me, Sarah affirmed with conviction. We're stronger together, William. We'll face this as a team. The following days were tense in the Thompson mansion. William avoided his father, locking himself in his study or spending hours in the garden with Sarah. Mr. Thompson, oblivious to the approaching storm, continued making grand plans for the heir's birth. It was during a family dinner when everything exploded. Mr. Thompson was talking enthusiastically about the best doctors in the capital, suggesting that Sarah should undergo a series of treatments to ensure a healthy pregnancy. After all, Mr. Thompson said, raising his glass, we must do everything possible to ensure the baby is born perfect. William stood up abruptly, his chair falling to the floor with a crash. Like you did with my mother? He asked, his voice trembling with rage. Mr. Thompson paled. What are you talking about, son? He asked, trying to maintain his composure. Don't call me son, William spat. Not after what you did to my mother. How could you risk her life like that? How could you subject her to those treatments, knowing they could harm her? The silence that followed was deafening. Mr. Thompson looked at his son with a mixture of shock and shame. William, he began, his voice breaking, I didn't know the treatments were so dangerous. I only wanted the best for you, for our family. The best? William shouted. Look at me, father, is this the best? A life of rejection and mockery, is this what you wanted for me? Sarah stood up, positioning herself next to William and taking his hand. Mr. Thompson, she said firmly, we understand that your intentions were good, but we can't repeat the mistakes of the past. This baby, our child, will be loved and accepted no matter how they're born. Mr. Thompson looked at them, tears forming in his eyes. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry, William. I never meant to hurt your mother. I never meant to hurt you. William looked at his father, years of pain and resentment reflecting in his eyes. I need time, he finally said, time to process all of this, to forgive. With these words, William left the dining room, leaving Sarah and Mr. Thompson in an uncomfortable silence. He loves you, Sarah said softly to Mr. Thompson, but he needs to heal, you both do. Mr. Thompson nodded, suddenly looking much older and tired. You're right, he admitted. I've made many mistakes, but I promise you, Sarah, that I'll do everything I can to make amends, to be the father and grandfather my family deserves. Sarah smiled softly, feeling that, despite the pain, this confrontation was the first step towards healing for the Thompson family. The following months were a period of adjustment and reconciliation. William and his father began to have long conversations, unearthing old wounds and trying to heal them. Sarah, meanwhile, focused on her pregnancy, surrounded by the love and support of her husband and, little by little, her father-in-law. As her belly grew, so did the anticipation in the Thompson mansion. But this time, it wasn't an anticipation laden with impossible expectations, but with unconditional love and acceptance. One night, as Sarah and William rested in the garden, they felt the baby's first movements. William placed his hand on Sarah's belly, marveling at the life growing inside her. I love you, he whispered, gently kissing Sarah. You and our baby. No matter what they're like, they'll be perfect to us. Sarah smiled, tears of happiness shining in her eyes. "They will be," she affirmed, "because they'll be ours." As the sun set over the Thompson mansion, bathing the garden in golden hues, Sarah and William embraced, their hearts full of hope for the future that awaited them. A future that, despite the challenges, they would face together with love and strength. The months passed quickly in the Thompson mansion. Sarah's belly grew day by day, as did the expectation and love in the family. William had become a devoted husband, attentive to Sarah's every need, while Mr. Thompson, in an attempt to redeem himself, had transformed into a caring and protective future grandfather. One spring morning, when the first rays of sun began to illuminate the garden that Sarah and William had cultivated together, the young woman felt the first contractions. "William," she whispered, gently, shaking her husband who slept beside her, "it's time." The next hours were a whirlwind of activity. William, overcome by panic and excitement, ran throughout the house, waking the servants, and his father, Mr. Thompson, maintaining the calm that years had given him, took charge of calling the doctor, and the midwife Sarah was taken to the room they had prepared for the birth. As she lay on the bed, breathing deeply to cope with the pain of contractions, she couldn't help but think of William's mother, how she must have experienced these moments. She vowed to herself that her story would have a different ending. William remained by her side the entire time, holding her hand, whispering words of love and encouragement. Mr. Thompson waited outside the room, pacing back and forth, praying for the first time in years. The hours passed slowly. The sun reached its zenith and began to descend, tinting the sky in orange hues. And it was then, just as the first evening star appeared in the firmament, that the cry of a baby was heard. "It's a boy," announced the midwife, holding the newborn. William, with tears in his eyes, looked at his son for the first time. The baby was small, with a tuft of dark hair and eyes that, upon briefly opening, revealed the same deep blue tone as his father's. "He's perfect," William whispered, his voice laden with emotion. Sarah, exhausted but radiant, extended her arms to receive her son. When she cradled him against her chest, she felt her heart overflow with love. "Welcome to the world, John," she said softly, naming the baby in honor of her own father. William sat next to her on the bed, surrounding his small family with his arms. At that moment, all the doubts and fears that had plagued his mind for months vanished. It didn't matter what his son looked like. They would love him unconditionally. Mr. Thompson was invited to enter the room. The old man approached with trembling steps, his eyes fixed on the small bundle in Sarah's arms. May I see him?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah nodded, gently uncovering the baby's face. Mr. Thompson leaned in, his eyes filling with tears as he saw his grandson for the first time. "He's beautiful," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "William, Sarah, I'm so sorry. For everything I promise, I'll be the best grandfather I can be to this little one." William looked at his father, years of resentment dissolving at the sight of the old man moved by his grandson. "I know, Father," he said softly. "You will be." The days that followed were a whirlwind of visits and celebrations. The news of the birth of the Thompson heir spread quickly through the region. However, to the surprise of many, there were no grand parties or grandiose announcements. Instead, the Thompson family opted for an intimate celebration, focused on love and family unity. One afternoon, as Sarah was nursing John in the garden, with William by her side, they noticed Mr. Thompson approaching with an envelope in his hand. "There's something I must confess to you," the old man began, his voice laden with emotion. "Something I discovered recently, but didn't know how to tell you." Sarah and William exchanged a worried look. "What is it, Father?" William, asked Mr. Thompson, took a deep breath before continuing. "A few weeks ago, while reviewing some old documents, I found this." He extended the envelope towards them. "It's a letter from your mother, William, written shortly before you were born." With trembling hands, William took the envelope. Sarah, holding John with one arm, placed her free hand on her husband's shoulder in support. William opened the envelope and began to read aloud. My dear son, if you're reading this, it means I'm not there to tell you in person. But there's something you need to know. Something your father and I discovered recently. Your condition, that which the world calls a deformity, was not caused by the treatments I underwent during pregnancy. It's a genetic condition, something you were born with. The doctors confirmed it to us recently. I want you to know that I love you exactly as you are. You are perfect in my eyes, and I know you will be a wonderful man. Don't let the world tell you otherwise. And if someday you have children of your own, don't be afraid. This condition is not hereditary. Your children will be born healthy, free from the burdens you have had to carry. I love you, my little one. I will always be with you, Mom. The silence that followed the reading of the letter was profound. William stared at the paper in his hands, tears freely running down his cheeks. I didn't know, said Mr. Thompson, his voice breaking. I found the letter recently, and I didn't know how to tell you, William, my son. I'm so sorry I spent years blaming myself, blaming you, when in reality it was no one's fault, Sarah finished softly. William looked up, first at his father, then at Sarah, and finally at his son, who slept peacefully in his mother's arms. All my life, he began, his voice trembling, I've carried this weight, believing it was a punishment, that it was the result of ambition and mistakes. And now you know the truth, said Sarah, leaning in to kiss his cheek. You are who you are, William, and we love you for it. Mr. Thompson approached, placing a trembling hand on his son's shoulder. Forgive me, William, for not being the father you needed, for not loving you as you deserved. William looked at his father, years of pain and resentment dissolving in the face of this new truth. Slowly he stood up, and to everyone's surprise hugged Mr. Thompson. I forgive you, Father, he whispered, and I hope you can forgive me too. As father and son reconciled, Sarah looked at her little John. The baby opened his eyes, looking at her with that pure innocence of newborns. At that moment, Sarah knew that despite all the challenges, they had found their happy ending. The Thompson family had gone through trials and tribulations. They had faced prejudices and fears, but in the end, love had triumphed. A love that had grown from an arranged marriage, that had blossomed in the garden of adversity, and that now bore fruit in the form of a new life and a reunited family. As the sun set over the Thompson mansion, bathing the garden in golden hues, Sarah, William, Mr. Thompson, and little John formed a picture of love and redemption. The young farm girl who had once accepted a marriage out of duty now found herself at the center of a family united by the purest love. And so in that garden that Sarah and William had cultivated together, among the roses that symbolized their growing love, the Thompson family welcomed a new dawn, a future full of hope, acceptance, and above all, unconditional love.